Welcome to Personal Injury Claims Explained by Foyle Legal, your trusted source for personal injury claims in Western Australia. Each week, we simplify complex legal issues, from motor vehicle accidents to workplace injuries, so you can confidently navigate your rights and secure the compensation you deserve.
All right, so today we're diving into a tough topic, but a really important one. We're talking about what happens when someone dies because of their job, specifically looking at workplace fatality compensation.
And we're going deep on this one. We've got two really helpful sources, one from the government agency, WorkCover WA, and another from the Legal Eagles over at Foyle Legal.
Exactly. And, going through both, it's clear this isn't a walk in the park emotionally or legally. So we're breaking it down, no jargon, just the facts to help you understand what's what.
Absolutely, because if, God forbid, this ever happens to someone you love, you don't want to be wrestling with confusing legal stuff on top of everything else. Knowledge is power. Right.
100%. And one thing that both sources hit on right away is this idea of dependency. It's not as simple as just, oh, they're family, right?
Not at all. Think
Yeah.
of it like, you know how a family tree branches out? It's not about those lines on paper, but who actually depended on the person who passed away for financial support.
Right, like a spouse, kids, maybe even a parent or sibling in certain situations. It gets kind of complicated.
It can, for sure. And that's where the WorkCover WA guide gets really interesting to give this example. And it really made me think.
Okay, hit me with it. What's the example?
So let's say your brother, he's the main breadwinner, sadly passes away in a workplace accident. Now, he's got a wife and kids, right? But you, you were financially dependent on him too. Could you be eligible for compensation?
Whoa, that's a tough one. So it's not automatically a no just because there's a spouse and children,
Exactly. WorkCover WA, they look at the bigger picture, the actual financial reliance.
which is where I'm guessing having your ducks in a row documentation wise is absolutely crucial.
You got it. Proving that dependence is key. Bank statements, financial records, anything that shows that connection to the deceased person's income, you got to have it. WorkCover WA won't even consider a claim without it.
So it's not just about the grief and loss, it's about proving that financial link. And speaking of what you might actually receive, both sources break it down into like four main categories.
Yeah, so you've got the lump sum payment that's a one-time payout. Then there's the allowance, specifically for dependent children. That's a regular thing. Those are the big ones. And depending on your relationship to the deceased, you might also be eligible for funeral expenses, medical expenses related to the injury, things like that.
Okay, makes sense. So let's unpack that lump sum a bit
Yeah.
because table one in the WorkCover AA guide, it's clear this isn't always a straightforward thing. They call it a dependent lump sum entitlement, DLSE for short. And how it gets divided up, well, that depends on the dependent's rate.
Yeah, it gets complex fast. Multiple spouses or partners, maybe ex-partners in the mix, kids, maybe even extended family. Suddenly you're talking fractions and percentages based on their relationship to the deceased.
Definitely seeing why you'd want a lawyer to help navigate that.
Oh, for sure.
Now, the child allowance, that seems a bit more straightforward. It's paid out until a child turns 16 or 21 if they're still in school full time.
You got it. And WorkCover WA manages those payments directly, making sure the money goes towards the child's care. It's a safety net, especially if the deceased parent was the primary caregiver. Now, the funeral and medical expenses, those are a bit more, well,
Self explanatory,
exactly.
but still important to know about. Okay, so we've got a sense of what they might receive, but how does this whole claims process actually work? It feels pretty overwhelming just thinking about it.
It definitely can be, especially during such a difficult time. But luckily, WorkCover WA lays it all out in a step-by-step guide, figure one of their document, if you want to follow along at home.
Awesome. So let's say the unthinkable happens, a loved one dies in a workplace accident. Now, on top of the grief, you've got to figure out how to actually make a claim. Let's break it down step by step. What's first?
So first things first, someone has to actually claim. Usually it's a spouse, a guardian, or another dependent, and they have to lodge it with the deceased person's employer.
Interesting. So the employer becomes kind of like a middleman.
Exactly. They're legally obligated to send that claim to their insurer within 7 days.
Yeah.
And the insurer, well, they're the ones with the money, so they're the ones assessing the claim.
Gotcha. So even though the insurer is ultimately managing the money side, WorkCover WA is still involved right from the get-go, even in that assessment stage.
Absolutely. They're keeping an eye on things throughout the whole process. They're not just a hands-off kind of organization.
Interesting. And this is something that the Foyle legal guide really emphasizes. Lodging the claim, that's just the first hurdle. It's what happens after that can get really complicated.
Yeah, for sure. It can involve a lot of back and forth, gathering even more information, maybe even needing a lawyer to fight for your full entitlement. But we'll get into all of that in a bit.
Makes sense. Now, both sources are very clear about one thing. Documentation is key. Feels like you need a whole filing cabinet just to get started. What kind of paperwork are we even talking about here?
You're telling me the WorkCover WA Guide, Part 4, and the documents needed to make a claim section from Foyle Legal, they both lay out the nitty-gritty. But basically think of it like this. You need to prove everything.
Okay, break it down for me. What are the absolute must-haves?
All right, so the basics. Proof of death, that's a given, right? A death
Yeah.
certificate, coroner's report, whatever's official. But then it gets more personal. You need to prove your relationship to the deceased.
Right, because like we were saying earlier, it's not enough to just be related. It's about proving that dependency.
100%. Spouse. Marriage certificate, easy peasy. But de facto partner. WorkCover WA, they want details. They call them supporting particulars. But it's basically painting a picture. Where you lived, how you shared finances, even if your social circle recognized you as a couple.
Wow, so it's not enough to just say you live together. You need receipts, bank statements, the whole 9 yards.
Pretty much. And same goes for children, birth certificates, school enrollment records if they're older. It's all about backing up that claim of dependency.
And I'm guessing if it's an extended family member making the claim, like in that example earlier, that's where the paperwork really piles up.
Oh yeah, they've got a higher bar to clear.
Hmm.
It gets complicated.
So much paperwork. And then on top of all that, you've got the financial side of things, proving you actually relied on the deceased person's income. This is where things get really down to the wire.
It does. This is where those tax returns, bank statements showing financial support, even legal orders for things like child support, they all become super important. Both sources really emphasize having that clear financial paper trail to support your claim.
Okay, so let's say we've got mountains of paperwork. We've proven our relationship and our financial dependence. What happens next? This is where the arbitrator comes in, right?
Exactly. And this is where Part 5, that WorkCover WA guide, it gets super interesting. They dedicate a whole section to explaining what the arbitrator actually does.
And just to remind our listener, an arbitrator is kind of like a judge, right? But specifically for these workers' compensation cases, they're the ones who make the final call.
That's a great way to put it. And here's where it gets really interesting before. It doesn't matter if the insurer agrees with the claim or not. The arbitrator still has to make a decision about how much compensation is awarded.
Hold on. So even if the insurer says, yes, you're eligible, it's still up to the arbitrator to make the final call on everything? That's surprising, right? It's not like they just rubber stamp it.
Nope, they have the final say. Think of the insurer as, one voice in the room, but the arbitrator, they're like the referee, making sure everything's on the up and up.
Makes sense. So they're looking at everything, not just whether the death happened at work, but all those details about dependency, the types of compensation, the whole shebang.
Absolutely. And remember, those complex calculations for the lump sum payment, like who gets what percentage based on the relationship to the deceased.
Yeah, that seemed like a whole other level of complicated.
It can be. That's all part of what the arbitrator considers when they issue what's called a compensation order. That's the document that lays it all out. Who gets what, how much, how often, the whole 9 yards.
So it's like their final verdict, their judgment call on the case. No more back and forth after that.
Exactly. And here's something interesting WorkCover WA points out. Right. The arbitrator, they actually have some flexibility. Like, let's say there's a young child who's a beneficiary. The arbitrator might decide, instead of giving a huge sum directly to the surviving parent, they might put it in a trust until the child's older.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. You wouldn't want to hand a teenager a mountain of money without some guardrails.
Exactly. And a lot of times, WorkCover WA, they actually end up acting as that trustee, especially for children, making sure the money's used for the right things.
So they're not just cutting a check and saying, see you later. They're in it for the long haul.
You got it. It's all part of their role, making sure the dependents are taken care of. And that actually ties back into why that law firm, Foyle Legal, they really stress getting legal advice if you're ever in this situation.
Because even with those step-by-step guides, it can still feel overwhelming.
Oh, absolutely. Having a lawyer who knows this stuff inside and out, it's like having a guide through a maze. They can make sure you're not missing any opportunities, that you understand all your options.
Yeah, it's peace of mind when you really need it most. And speaking of resources, both WorkCover WA and Foyle Legal, they mention go for help.
So you know you're getting the right advice from someone who really gets it.
That's good to know. You're not alone in this. Now, we've covered a lot of ground here, and it's heavy stuff, no doubt. But before we wrap things up, I wanted to circle back to something that really struck me. Something both sources touch on: the emotional toll this takes on families.
Yeah, it's huge. We can't forget about the human side of this. Losing someone you love, it's never easy. But when it's sudden, and because of something like this, well, the grief can be even more intense.
It's not just the financial loss, it's the loss of a future together. And on top of that grief, families are suddenly thrust into this world of legal stuff, paperwork, deadlines.
Right. It's a lot to handle. And honestly, I think that's why understanding your rights, having access to clear information like what we've talked about today, it's so important.
Because knowledge is power, right?
Exactly. Because while nothing can truly make up for losing a loved one, knowing your rights, having access to that financial support, it can take some of the pressure off during a really, really tough time.
It's about finding a way forward when the worst happens. And that's what we've tried to do today. Give you a roadmap, not just the legal and financial stuff, but also acknowledging the emotional reality of all this.
Because it's not just about ticking boxes on forms, right? It's about understanding what support's out there for you during a really tough time.
Exactly. So for everyone listening, if you've been taking notes, hopefully you've got a better idea of what questions to ask, what documents to gather, and where to find that expert help if you need it.
And keep in mind, every situation is different. There's no one-size-fits-all here. So talking to a professional, getting personalized advice, that's always a good move.
Couldn't agree more. Being informed is key, and hopefully after this deep dive, you're feeling a bit more prepared, just in case you ever have to face this kind of situation.
You're not alone. Remember that. There's support out there, people who can guide you, and a way to navigate through this even when it feels impossible.
Well said. And on that note, everyone, stay safe and stay informed. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to Personal Injury Claims, explained by Foyle Legal. Remember, this podcast is for informational purposes and isn't legal advice. For advice specific to your situation, visit us at Foyle Legal. And don't forget to subscribe or leave a review.